Raising the Conversation, Season 3, Tomorrow's Church, a podcast by the MacRae Centre for Faith and Culture at Acadia Divinity College, with your host Joel Murphy, facilitator of trend research and analysis here at the MacRae Centre.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Raising the Conversation podcast. My name is Joel Murphy. I work at the MacRae Centre within our Futuring Hub, and today's conversation, I'm excited for it as usual. Today we have Oliver Locke, who's a pastor of youth ministry. Oliver is a graduate of Kingswood University with a Bachelor of Arts in Worship Ministry, and he's currently doing his MA in Theology at Acadia Divinity College. In the area of future studies and theofutures, and so I get to work with Oliver. We've worked together here at the college a little bit, and I'm excited to be able to kind of hear from him as he thinks about and in his work thinking about not only future studies and what it is, but also in his role as a pastor. I think he brings a really unique perspective into this space. So Oliver, thank you for coming. Yeah, so I guess just starting the conversation, in your work, in your graduate work, you're looking at the intersection of future studies and the church. Could you explain a little bit about what the field of future studies is, how you're approaching thinking about and how you're approaching that, and as well as how you're thinking about the possible futures as a pastor and as a follower of Jesus, as you kind of engage in this, because obviously future studies is a discipline unto itself outside of the theological educational space. But how are you engaging with it as a pastor and as a follower of Christ?
Yeah, so I guess first, just explain what future studies is. I think that is important because when I first heard about future studies, it sounded like very abstract or like kind of very like just somebody's subjective intuition about what the future is going to be like, and so I think it was helpful for me to learn, really what future studies is. It's a discipline that looks at how to think well about the future, and like it's known for certain methods and tools for making forecasts about the future, but it's really more looking at what are the various possible future scenarios as opposed to predicting like the one future that's going to happen. And the other thing that I think was really helpful for me was learning more about how future studies is used in businesses, particularly a method called strategic foresight. And now, like, the church isn't the same as a business, right? Like, sometimes people get kind of freaked out by that. But the reality is that the church is a group of people. It's an organization of people trying to accomplish a mission together. And now, like, businesses like have a totally different bottom line, and they may have different like structure and hierarchy and whatever, but there is things that the church can learn from businesses and from just like how do groups of people work well together for a common aim. And so when I started learning more about how businesses use future studies, it became more clear to me like how this could relate to local churches and how it could actually be useful for local churches.
Obviously, we've talked a lot about this, and this is kind of the root of my role as well. Like, I think you're right. The thing about future studies is this idea of how to intentionally consider and think about possible futures, recognizing that it's open, like you said, the cone of plausibility, which is a really helpful resource, I think, to share and kind of visualize it. But yeah, the value of it is to be able to think about what possibly could happen and then be able to engage with strategically. Like, I think from a business standpoint, that makes sense. And particularly now we're seeing, I think, an increase in people engaging with future studies to try and think intentionally, because you can never fully predict the future, but you can anticipate it. And so trying to consider and think about what could be from a business perspective, like you mentioned, is very beneficial, because you can think about emerging consumer trends, emerging technologies that you need to be responsive to, possibly disruptions in the market. And so then as a business, it changes things. But obviously, from a Christian perspective and from the church, not necessarily about generating profits, I don't think. So I guess this is kind of skipping ahead, and we can recircle the different things. But when you think about futures thinking or future studies, how do you see value in it, or how it could be beneficial for a church?
Right.
Like, where is that? How do you reconcile that so that's not just all about like generating profit or whatnot?
Right. Yeah. So I think for me, as I've been working on this master's studies and a thesis looking at future studies, I really wanted to keep this as kind of a guiding principle of like whatever I spit out at the end, I want it to actually be useful for local churches and actually be useful kind of tangibly, kind of concretely. And one thing that was very inspiring to me, there's actually a book by Sine and Friesen. I forget their first names because you only ever reference the last names in an academic paper, but called 2020's Foresight, and they're both kind of more in the church world, but using future studies to think about local churches. And it was kind of like very like gritty, like I guess it was more tangible and concrete things about the future of a community than sometimes, and at the Featuring Hub, we're often thinking about like what's the future of like the world and these mega trends that seem like so huge and daunting, that do relate to every little community in Nova Scotia, because those are mega trends influencing people broadly. But how Son and Friesen really talked about thinking about the future of your community so that your church can serve your community well in the next 5 years or 10 years as your community changes. I think it was really tangible. Like one of the things they talked about, that I got thinking about was like housing, and so in my town, there's this big housing development proposed. And I think there's lots of towns in Nova Scotia right now with these big housing developments being proposed because there's all these people moving here. There's a housing crisis. And so, this is this possible future scenario. This developer wants to build, I forget, it's like housing for 1,000 more people, and that would double my town's population. And so just thinking about like, what would be the ramifications for my community if that actually happens, right? So it's still just a possible future. It hasn't been approved by the town or I don't know what all kind of approval it needs. There's not bulldozers out there yet, but let's imagine that there was like those indicators that this is actually going to start to happen. The town approves it. There's bulldozers out in the field. We're still a year out from houses being built and people moving in. What could our church do to prepare for 1,000 more people moving to Middleton? And let's think about like how would that change the demographics of our town? How would that change the needs in our town? What needs would all of those people have? Like in the development plan, it kind of outlines how many would be single family housing and multi-unit housing and all that jazz. So like you could look into that and really tangibly look at what could we do now to prepare well for what people might need in our community. And so like in my mind, that's it's not about like profit. It's about like meeting the needs of people and anticipating them, as opposed to always having to react after the needs are presented and then we're in a crisis. And so I think that's where it can get really tangible for local churches.
I love that example, and we've chatted about that. I think that's a really, I think it offers an example of how, when we think about a future, and again, it doesn't have to be this revolutionary thing like, I know like artificial intelligence obviously is a big thing right now. Yeah. It doesn't and robots in the church. Yeah. It doesn't have, or like as we think about the future, flying cars, whatever it might be, it's something as tangible as we're seeing demographic shifts in our community. We're seeing a possible new build. And then I think prayerfully and obediently to the mission of the church, considering what do we now do in response to that. I think that's a really lovely example of how Futuring could support churches.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think you bring up prayer and discernment. I think that's the other key thing when we talk about like using business tools is like what uniquely do Christians bring to this? Like because you can do all the studies and all the, look at all the Stats Canada reports and stuff. But like, ultimately what we're asking is like, not just how can we join God in what he's doing right now in our community, but like, what might God be wanting to do in the next few years? And he may want to give us insight into that. We can seek God's will, and we can, discern together, initiatives he may want us to take on. And that, gathering the data is part of that discernment process, because we do that with every aspect of discernment. Like, we don't just go into a room and pray when we're, trying to decide what to do for a career. Like we look at what are our test results, what needs are there in the job market, like all of those different things, but always filtered through like, if God speaks very clearly and says to do something that doesn't seem to make any sense, like we still need to listen, even if it goes against the data.
Right.
But like, generally, I think he might kind of speak through some of those kind of tangible things that we see.
I love that. I think like it makes me think of Noah and like right into anticipating like this is happening. And I think a lovely thing that often I try to emphasize again and again whenever I have conversations around what futures thinking is or future studies is we do futuring all the time, right? We're
Right,
thinking
right.
we're an anticipatory people, whether you're right thinking about where you're going to go that day, what you're going to wear to
Hmm.
work, or
Hmm.
if you're thinking about your kids or your grandchildren and their career, we're always kind of in this anticipatory thinking or this future
Hmm.
thinking process. So it's not a completely, like you said, abstract concept. Like we're in it. And I think as Christians, there's a natural future orientation around because of our eschatological perspective of the
Hmm.
world.
Hmm.
Um, but I
Yeah.
think it's a. How do you, as a pastor, uh, obviously as a pastor, as a Christian, maybe it's less about being a pastor, but just as a Christian, like how do you hold that possible tension? Because I know that might have been a tension for you starting off between this idea of futuring and like God's redemptive plan, I suppose.
Hmm. Hmm.
Just to throw a
Yeah,
curveball
yeah,
at
no,
you.
I think it's an important thing. Like I think so yeah, there's various things come to mind for people when you say eschatology, because um there's the events leading up to Jesus's return is part of eschatology, but then so we'll do this as like a continuum. So there's the events leading up to Jesus' return, but then there's what will the new creation be like? Like when God renews all things and makes the new heaven and new earth, what will that be like when God's kingdom is fully realized?
Mm,
Because that's ultimately what informs the church's mission. I think one of the clearest articulations of the church's mission that I read is in the Missional Church, edited by Guter. They say together that the church's mission is to represent the kingdom of God. It's to represent God's reign, which both has a lived out, embodied aspect, but also like proclaiming like Jesus is king, and this is what it looks like when he's king. This is how humans are supposed to live under his rule. But also we're demonstrating that as the church in our life together and in how we live in the world. Um, and so yeah, so eschatology, what will the new creation be like, and what will the final fully realized kingdom of God be like, informs that's what we need to represent. So like, that's how we need to live in the world and the things we need to um embody, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the future is going to become more and more like that. I think that's where people sometimes get tripped up, is they think like we need to transform society, we need to make society more like the kingdom of God. I think that's a noble aim, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. It's not necessarily
mm,
promised. And throughout church history, there seems to be kind of these like waves of like, yeah, some really positive things happening and things becoming more like God's will being realized. I think we should see that if the church is living on mission. But then there's also the reality of evil is still in the world. Like it's the kingdom is not fully realized, and so then there's also these things that are getting worse in the world. And depending on where you live, especially, right? Um, and so I think eschatology informs the church's mission, but it doesn't necessarily give us clear, uh, ways to evaluate what we think is actually going to happen in the next 5 years. Like we can be
mm,
confident of the end, but we've got no idea if the next 5 years are going to become more like the kingdom or less like the kingdom. Like
mm.
we have no idea. Like eschatology doesn't teach us that. Uh, yeah. So there is a tension there for sure.
Yeah. No, that's well, and I think that's a helpful like framing because it speaks to the idea of agency of and as us being involved, and that while the world is changing, it's up to the church and individual Christians in terms of how we respond to that.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
as we move into those spaces of uncertainty, which the future is very uncertain, especially now, it feels like more so than ever.
Hmm.
Um, like the way in which we engage with those possible futures is constructive to think about from that
Hmm.
theological
Hmm.
perspective. Like what is God's mission for us now in this time in this place? And I think then that kind of framing can allow us to recognize and value and celebrate some of the traditions and the principles that we have embedded as a church for a very long time, but then also think innovatively and creatively with God's imagination around what could this look like in the next 5, 10, 15,
Hmm.
20 years.
Hmm.
I think that's lovely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Something I was thinking about recently, as I was reading about stuff, some of these people writing are writing for, huge corporations or governments, right, with gajillions of dollars, to invest in things. And so one of the things they're talking about is like, okay, we're looking at these different possible scenarios. So you got this possible scenario with this much likelihood and this much impact. Like if this happens, it will have this degree of severity or positive impact, whatever. And so we need to like prepare for that this much. And okay, this one's quite unlikely, but if it happens, it's very significant. So we need to kind of prepare for that, but it's more of like a contingency plan, whatever. Um, but I'm just thinking as a pastor, like we've got like just enough money to get by and just enough manpower, like between volunteers and staff, to like run the things we're already doing. Like, how can we prepare for all of these scenarios? Like, that seems unrealistic, in the context of my local church, at least.
I love
And
that.
so I guess that's been something I've been thinking about recently that feels disempowering, or I feel like I feel overwhelmed by that of like, okay, well then what if we can't be confident in the one future, we have to have in mind all of these futures and prepare for them all. Like how are we going to prepare for all that? One thing I was thinking about, we'll have to swing back around, but there's one thought is I was traveling this spring and we were going for a walk to a family's house of this group that I was with. We were going for a walk to a family's house for dinner. It was about a 10-minute walk. And we checked the forecast. There was like a 30% chance of rain. And so I was like, okay, I don't need a raincoat. It's not going to rain. Because, I looked at the data, I'd made my forecast. Most likely scenario, it's not going to rain. Anyway, it downpoured on our walk, like absolute, like torrential downpour. And I was like, I'm done with future studies. This is useless. This is ridiculous. Like we can't anticipate the future. Like we have no ability to predict the future. Um, but like as I reflected on it later, when I was less, irritated by being wet, was like, well, that's exactly the point. Is like you can't just prepare for the one future you think is the most likely, but at the same time, it really wasn't a big deal because the severity of that unexpected future was very little. Like I wasn't walking there in a $3,000 suit. I wasn't going to the opera. Like I was uncomfortably damp for dinner,
Uh-huh.
but it was fine. And so I think something from that I was thinking about is, you know, determining which possible futures to prepare for. Part of what we need to do is like evaluate how significant would this be? If we're unprepared for it, is it going to like be a major problem or
Mm.
just an inconvenience or discomfort, right? And so, I think that the getting caught in the rain example is maybe helpful for that. Of like, there are some things that's like, yeah, it's unlikely and it's really not going to be that disruptive. So you just leave that one. But like, yeah, if you've got an important you're going out with your wife for your anniversary and you're all dressed up and it's calling for a bit of rain, you bring an umbrella, or you call a cab. I don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah, anyway, so that's just like one little thought on what we do about all those possible futures. But I think I'd be interested to talk more about that of like how do churches tangible like invest what resources we have to prepare for these things that might not even happen, right? What do you think about that?
Oh, I think it's a great question. I have two thoughts. I think one, it's coupled with this idea of approaching it from like whether strategic foresight or thinking about the future and identifying as you identify those possible futures. I think that's actually then the importance of that discernment and consider it in strategic planning, but like I would say just discernment and theological reflection. Like what
Mhm.
is God calling us to do in this season? We cannot respond necessarily to every possible future that is happening, but where is the Spirit moving? Where is
Mhm.
there opportunities for partnership? Where is God maybe already at work, and can we go there and partner with God in that space? I think that is as I
Mhm.
think about this idea of like there's so many things that are happening. How do we respond? I think in the discernment piece, it's around what is God calling us to, and what is God already maybe doing in us as a congregation or in our community. Um, I think coupled with that, and then we'll move on to our final question, even though I feel like we could talk about this for days.
Sure.
Um, I think there's something about, even if it's not about doing practical, tangible actions, when thinking about the future, if we're able to even develop in ourselves some sort of internal capacity or openness or flexibility or just grow in wisdom around considering the future and then being responsive again to what's happening around us, or even being proactive, if like that's the discerning piece. Like I think that if the church is able to understand, okay, these are possible futures. We're seeing a possible housing development in our community, like weak signals of in terms of like decline in sense of belonging. How do we belong together? How do we be in relationship together? How do we consider and anticipate all these different things? I think there's something around developing an openness to be not just dismissive of things that we're unsure of or fearful of, but to actually just have an openness to saying, okay, we as a congregation desire to be in relationship with each other, with God, and with our community. And then when we see these emerging trends of technology, of AI, all these pieces, how do we then, and maybe not every church is going to be able to then integrate artificial intelligence technology into their space, or have a website, or have a, well, you should probably have a website, but different technology pieces. How do we, instead of, I think it's about the posturing piece, like how do we move into those spaces and those unknown futures just with a level of openness?
Right.
And I think that's almost just not, it's not completely as valuable, but I think it's an important step in the terms of engaging with possible futures, because then we're not shutting those down.
Right.
Like we don't have to whole scale adopt every, like technology is an easy one. We don't have to whole scale adopt every emergent technology that comes our way.
Right.
But are we open to learning and considering and then intentionally reflecting on what are we going to do with this? But I think it's the discernment piece. I think that's a lovely question. But yeah. Oh, okay. Moving a final question, and
Sure.
I feel like we should just talk about that more. But when thinking about the future church, I know obviously within your research you're doing this, but also you're working with the next generation. When thinking about the future church, where do you find hope?
Yeah, I mean, something that was encouraging and inspiring for me was this spring I got to go with CBM, Canadian Baptist Ministries, has a program through Acadia and some other partner schools to go somewhere where they have missionaries essentially. So I got to go with one of the leaders from CBM to Europe to visit churches that are living on mission in a secular context, like in a really secular post-Christian context, because that'll help us learn about what's going on in Canada, hopefully. And we just got to meet some incredible churches, just like really, really incredible ministries and churches that were really living out that mission that we talked about of representing the kingdom of God, of both in terms of like doing tangible things that are transforming their community and people's lives in their community, but then also proclaiming Jesus and proclaiming like his reign and seeing people come to faith in Jesus and submit to his kingship. And so it was just like, I don't know, sometimes when we think about the church and when we study the church, and it can be very negative or it can be discouraging because there's a lot of negative signs about the church, and like the church is declining, and we're not responding to this issue and that issue and whatever. And sometimes it can feel like no one out there is doing anything good, and we've got to kind of reinvent the wheel and build it from the ground up ourselves or whatever if we're going to do anything good. And it's like, that's not true. Like there are people out there and there are churches out there that are amazing and doing incredible work. And to be able to learn from them was so encouraging to me. And I think that's something that, yeah, I hope that more of us can do. And, in terms of the college, but also as pastors, just like to not feel like we're all alone and we have to figure this all out. But like there are people out there who are doing really incredible things that may translate or have some sort of principles that may translate to living out that mission in our context in the future. And so, yeah, I think that's something that's been really encouraging me and giving me hope for the future, is like there are great things happening out there, and I want to be a part of that.
That's I love that. I think there's so much wisdom in that, in terms of there's good things happening. We're not alone. Like we heard that in a recent gathering around like doing ministry alone is hard, and so you're not alone in finding your team and finding also individuals who are trying and doing, failing and succeeding and being willing to do that, I think that's a lovely, I'm encouraged by that. I appreciate that. Yeah, well, and Oliver, I want to thank you so much for your willingness to have the conversation. Thank you for your good questions around, as we think about thinking about the future, as we think about considering possible responses, how do we do that well, recognizing that our resources are limited, whether that's financial or human or whatnot. But I think there's some real wisdom in that and thinking about it. But I think there's also the nugget of hope saying, like, we are enough. Like, God obviously is enough and can support us in the midst of it. But even in a current point in time when the future feels so uncertain and there's so much change, that we are still able to move forward in a way that is good and honoring and aligned with the mission of the church. And so thank you for that. Thank you for your insights and your wisdom. And I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.